Welcome, listeners. My name is Bryce,
My name is Aiden.
and today we'll be discussing Frank Lorenzo. He was a businessman who was very influential to the aviation industry, particularly after the Deregulation Act. So we'll get started today by first talking about the background of Frank Lorenzo, sort of who he was and how he got started in the airlines. So, who was Frank Lorenzo?
So, Frank Lorenzo was a notable and controversial figure of the U.S. airline industry during the early days, I'll say. Born in 1940 in New York City, graduated from Columbia University as well as Harvard.
What a prestigious institution.
Yeah. Wish we could go there, but we didn't, so it's fine. He rose to prominence after taking over the Texas International Airlines in the 1970s, later turning it profitable through low fares and some light innovation.
And some of that innovation included some, we'll say, sketchy, definitely controversial ideas. One thing that he did, we'll get into later, but it involved the Chapter 11 protections and what he could do with that.
So, if you want to kind of describe what his early life was like, based on like his education, his business models, some ventures and some purchases and things that he did to further up his career.
Yeah, so Frank Lorenzo, he was born in 1940 in New York City, and he obviously went to Harvard and Columbia, where he got his MBA. He got started in finance originally. He didn't start with airlines.
Well, my dad did that.
Did he?
True story.
Interesting. Is your dad Frank Lorenzo?
He's not.
And then, once he got started into finance, he used some of his gains that he got financially to start Jet Capital Corp., and then he did that in 1972. And then later that year, he got into acquiring his first airline, which was Texas International Airlines. And that was a cheaper airline because it was struggling so much. They weren't able to make money. They were losing a bunch of money. So he acquired them, and that was his first airline, first of many. And then as he was CEO, he used some questionable methods to turn that airline profitable. The arguably worst one was that under Chapter 11 protections, when you file for bankruptcy, you're allowed to end union contracts. So the unionized employees no longer had the protections that their contracts had. So that meant that Lorenzo could pay them a much lower rate or simply fire them. And since the workers are one of the biggest expenses of aviation, he was able to make it profitable through that.
I didn't know that.
That's how he got to start in the airline industry.
Cool. Sounds like a pretty... Oh, what's the word I'm going to use? Why am I drawing a blank? Pretty extraordinary guy.
You'd think so. Not very popular, though.
So let's talk about his expansion with the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 as well as its impact. So for the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, he removed some of the government controls over airline fares, routes that marketed the entry. He increased some of the competition, lowered some of the fares, which ultimately got him started in his first business, which ultimately made that business successful. That was Texas International Airlines. He created a tough environment through traditional carriers and labor unions. Like we stated earlier, he formed Texas Air Corporation, holding that company. Acquired Continental Airlines in 1981. Used that bankruptcy to cut costs and void labor contracts, and then he later acquired Eastern Airlines in 1986. After that
The method that he used to acquire both of those airlines was also somewhat more new. It's what we call today a hostile takeover. So what he did was he bought enough shares so that he could have a voting say in the corporation. And given his reputation with cutting labor contracts, people didn't like it when he did things like that. So they tried to avoid his hostile takeovers by buying their own shares. So the company, they would sometimes have their workers buy the shares, or the CEO and people like that would buy the shares to prevent the hostile takeover. But for Continental Airlines, the CEO himself was actually so against having Lorenzo acquire the airline that he actually committed suicide once he learned that Lorenzo had succeeded in his endeavor, which is rather sad. So, with that in mind, let's talk about why Lorenzo was so controversial.
So we had many labor relations that focused on the aggressive union tactics, excuse me, that led to some strikes and some unrest in that agency. The Continental Airline bankruptcy was a pretty big cut cost that drew back a lot of the value of the airline, which also brought heavy criticism. So Eastern's failure was accosted by the asset stripping and management, which led to more labor strikes and the airline's eventual collapse. Following that, with the federal ban of 1990, that banned the U.S. government from the airline industry due to its poor labor practices and mismanagement.
Along with mismanagement, Lorenzo, while he didn't have his successes with bringing up dead airlines, he also struggled a little bit too. I believe both Texas and was it Eastern and Continental both went bankrupt once he acquired them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about his legacy next. So what was he sort of known for?
Pretty much well known for his pioneering of the cost-cutting industry as a whole. So cutting down fares, for deregulation, his strategies with that airline industry, and then he also mixed some reputation. He was seen as a visionary by some and was criticized by others for his labor ideals and the way he thought labor should be carried out.
Which makes sense. If you cut someone's wages in half or more,
you're gonna have people mad at you.
Absolutely, especially with as many people as were employed by the airlines that he took over.
Let's talk about some of his current usage strategies and how they might be used today.
Absolutely. So one of the ones that we hear of quite a bit today is a hostile takeover that he somewhat pioneered, which is when you buy all the shares of a company so that you have a voting say, so you own the majority. Other things that we use today would be like restructuring or using the Chapter 11 protections so that you can cut union contracts so you can have lower wages for your employees.
There we go.
Not so much just Lorenzo, but one of the things he did that's still in use is cost cutting.
Yeah.
And then
lowering
the fares so that you're more of a competitor and people are more likely to buy what you've got.
Mm-hmm. Well, considering there's so many airlines today, if all their fares were really, really similar, it wouldn't really make a difference for where you fly or where you choose to fly.
Right.
That's why I think a lot of the airlines have different values or different areas where they are better than others in some regard.
For sure.
We'll continue and talk a little bit about his post-airline career. So after leaving the airline industry, he founded Savoy Capital, which was an investment firm that focused on the finance and philosophy that serving on boards and making donations with institutions like Columbia University, the school he attended, as well as the Hispanic Society of America were important. He also tried for one last time at the airline industry crack in 1993. He attempted to found Friendship Airlines, but CPCN, or Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, denied him, and that was by the DOT.
That's right. Tried to make up for his lack of a good reputation by being a philanthropic figure, but he wasn't quite successful. Not as successful as he would have wanted.
Yeah. Overall, though, from what it sounds like and from the research that we've done, sounds like a pretty good guy for trying to take a crack at saving 2 or 3 airlines and trying to start his own later after he decided to build that investing firm.
He reminds me a bit of the guy who invented dynamite. Can't remember his name, but he was called the Merchant of Death, and he hated that.
Yeah.
I think Lorenzo's a little bit like him.
Yeah, sort of.
Doesn't like being known as the guy that cuts wages.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so from what we've talked about, he was pretty much a key figure in reshaping the airline industry, known for his aggressive cost-cutting and anti-union tactics.
Absolutely. He was known for acquiring and restructuring airlines, sometimes driving them to bankruptcy, like Texas International, Continental, and Eastern. He also tried to found some of his own, such as the Friendship Airlines, which failed. His legacy was pretty mixed. He pioneered deregulating practices such as cost-cutting and restructuring some of the lower wages and whatnot, but he also faced significant criticism for cutting those wages of workers by as much as half or even more.
Yeah. I think a lot of his business tactics that he implied in the early aviation sector are still used today, such as like the labor cost. I feel like
Absolutely.
cost cutting is still in effect, especially in today's economy.
Not to
as
mention
well as
hostile takeovers.
Oh yeah, as well as hostile takeovers, as well as the labor cuts and hostile takeovers. That's what I was going to say.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take that from you.
No, it's all good. Overall, pretty transformative guy for the airline sector mostly. I think some of his methods are still up for debate. Some people feel strongly about it than others, but overall.
What do you personally think about Frank Lorenzo?
I think he's a pretty good guy. I think majority of what he tried to do was relatively good. I know if I was probably an airline employee during the 1940s and 50s and I got my wages cut, I'd probably not like the guy, but
That's
who
fair.
knows? I mean, he probably did it for the good of the company and the good of the industry.
Yeah.
So.
And he managed to save a couple airlines from bankruptcy, though he drove a couple more into it. But it happens.
And then he later had a pretty good number of accomplishments, both the education, the airline industry, and that investment firm. So,
yep.
Yeah.
Personally, I think he wasn't as bad of a guy as perhaps history makes him out to be. He did his best. That's all you can ask.
Yeah. Well, nice to see you today.
You too. Thank you, listeners, for listening to our podcast. We hope you learned something about Frank Lorenzo and what he did for the airline industry.
Yeah. Have a good one.